I'm delighted to be here, even though it was on a last-minute basis. I find that what David is talking about, the issues that you've got in front of you, are fascinating for all of us. David, here's where I want to start. I mean, this can be so overwhelming when you take a look
Sure.
at all the issues of, the new connectivity of the world. So let's start at about 40,000 feet and try and bring it down over the
Okay.
next half hour to a soft landing on the ground. And let's start this way. Let's put ourselves, everybody here in the room, in a bit of a time machine, and let's go ahead 5 or 10 years. In 5 or 10 years, there's going to be 5 billion more people connected to each other. They're going to be accessing information for the first time in their lives. Most of them are going to be on smartphones or devices like that. Very few of them are going to be in English, and very few of the new participants are going to be in countries that we would recognize as mature democracies. So that's sort of the
Yes.
that's the plate that we lay down, and it leads to a whole bunch of questions.
Sure.
And I just wanted to get your views. First of all, on this, how is this going to affect the relationship between the citizen and the state? Because one assumes it's got to change.
Well, I think is this thing, it's on, right? Yeah, okay. So thanks for that. Tom, I think it's going to have enormous impacts all across the board. So we were talking about economics, societies, politics, culture, education, and the like. And I can talk a little bit about that in a bit. But in terms of the individual in the state, obviously what you're seeing in elections around the world, you're in developed countries, what you're seeing, you saw with the so-called Arab Spring, the use of technologies, social media, and so forth there. It's pretty clear that internet technologies are empowering people, right, in a lot of ways to become more involved in politics and governments, and that governments are going to have to adjust to that in some ways. I don't think it's going to be, a lot of us in the internet world, we seem to think there's this, this onward, clear march toward, this utopia, right? And we can be a little bit too utopian about this. I mean, the fact that these tools governments also know about the tools, right? And governments are also going to find ways to deal with this whole question of individual empowerment. Some of them will say, this is great. This is fantastic. How do I do more of this? And others are going to say, I'm not sure I like this very much. How can I figure out a way to either, curtail it and block it and filter, or can I figure out some way to use it the other way, authoritarian governments in particular. So I think what is certain to happen is kind of complicated situations that are very context sensitive and depend on the particular histories and cultures involved in terms of what's going to happen. But I don't think I wouldn't go so far as to say there's this fundamental shift in how governments have to deal and how they have to be accountable to their people. But it's going to cause a whole set of challenges with governance, right, and a whole set of opportunities for people to be more involved, for democracies, established democracies, to get better and more accountable, and for autocracies or emerging, countries that want to be democratic to get better.
And you're right in the sense that we'd like to think that everybody accessing the internet for the first time is only going to use this power for good,
Right,
as opposed to for evil. But in Google's case, because of your position in the world, and I know you personally, have had to deal with that line about what emerging democracies or entrenched dictatorships react to this new global hookup. Where does Google find itself on that line of saying we will cooperate with the government to this extent, but not to that extent?
Well, I mean, there are two things. I mean, we've become from, I met Larry and Sergey 15 years ago this coming summer, and Google were these two, students, and from that we're now 40,000 people. We're global. We operate in I don't know exactly how many countries, but a lot. And we have to, if you're going to be a local player, you're going to operate in country, you have to abide by local laws, right? At the same time, we're a values-driven company. People at Google don't go to work they go to work because they have a view about changing the world through technology. That's what they care about, and they care passionately about that, and they care. What goes along with that is openness and freedom and empowerment, and people take that extremely seriously. And the internet, like the internet, Google in our with that value set, regards sort of blocks censorship and those kinds of things as a bug, right? And it's something that needs to be routed around, right?
Right.
And so we do. When we run up against that, we have to face these choices. Now everybody knows the China situation and that whole history, but most of the cases that we have to deal with are more complicated, more subtle, and are dealing with countries that you wouldn't you might not suspect, right? In India, for instance. And there, it gets really difficult to say, okay, here's my values about free speech and expression and openness, and then you have to say, well, am I being overly American, overly Western in my view? When I have a view about free speech. If you're in India, you might say, well, saying bad things about people based on their group status gets people killed, right? That's our history, right? That's how we understand it. Whereas in the U.S., we don't really see it that way. And so we have to try to balance that and try to make that work. But our basic view is that we want to operate everywhere. We want to be a force for openness everywhere, and we want to work with governments who want to do that. When we run into the governments that don't want to do that, we try to stay away and try to serve that market from the outside, because we'd rather do that than the experience in China taught us that it's better to do that than to try to cooperate with a regime that doesn't want to change.
Let's take a look at this landscape from a different angle. I mean, we've been talking about how it works in these countries that are being introduced to the internet really for the first time. But let's take a look at it from the position of the mature democracies, such as the United States and Canada. With the world inevitably changing, becoming more connected, and the changes, cultural, political, and all the changes you've just been talking about, how does then a country like Canada position itself to take full advantage of this change, even at this point not fully understanding what that change is going to be?
Well, I think for a country like Canada, with all the talent, right, the long history, the rule of law, stable democracies, business formation, all of these things that you have here, the opportunities for economic growth by engaging with this new digital world, this new connected world, are enormous, right? Because you're talking about talent, talking about the ability to create businesses that would, do interesting things. I was telling you earlier that people may not think there's a startup scene, in Canada. Acquisitions is one of the things I handle. I think we've acquired something like seven or eight companies in Canada over the last couple of years. So there was a lot of energy, entrepreneurial energy, technical talent going on. So when you think about the ability to generate these kinds of companies, right, that can build the tools for the world, software, hardware, whatever it is. Obviously, the telecommunications expertise in Canada is probably second to none. And so you see that opportunity. But beyond that, beyond sort of the companies that are building the tools themselves, which I think Canada has a great opportunity to do in a much bigger way, it's getting the rest of the businesses in Canada connected to the web and connected with the rest of the world as much as possible. Because you see enormous opportunities in efficiencies and productivity. I was looking at a study that talked about how for a small business, like a startup business of the type you see in my neck of the woods, it used to cost $5 million to kind of get it up and running and have a really good business. That's those same expenses with the use of all kinds of back office tools and services over the web and the cloud and so forth is like $50,000, right? So it's a lot cheaper to build a business and get off the ground, and you can access new markets that you never could before, right? So Google, if anything, we have a huge business in people in one country, small businesses actually getting customers across sometimes across the world that they couldn't have accessed but for the internet. So there's the ability, this opportunity to be connected to the rest of the world, to sort of grow your economy as all these 5 billion people come online is enormous, and it's a much more level playing field because I think those opportunities are not about natural resources. They're not about manufacturing prowess. They're not about your military power. They're not about any of those things, and I think so that creates opportunities for everybody, including the developing world.
And that's one of the things you and I were talking about this. That's one of the things that you see out of this, the growth of a new creative force in parts of the world that haven't had the opportunity to do that before. So then it becomes a question for countries like Canada, like the United States and so on, if you foresee that there is going to be this sudden burst of creativity in places like Africa, in places like Indonesia, in countries that we haven't even thought of yet.
Right.
How do you then harness that? How do you step out and encourage it on the one hand, be globally minded at the same time, and yet have some proprietary interest in it? I mean, how does that all fit together?
Well, look, I think if you basically believe that trade and that kind of economic, interaction and economic activity is going to be good, then I mean you should embrace it, right? It can only be good for the world that the talented people that currently exist in Nigeria, right, or Indonesia or what have more opportunity to connect with the rest of the world, share their creativity, share the things that they create, the businesses they create from some great ideas. I mean, that can only be good for the rest of the world, right? So I think that we embrace that. We try to, when we work on multilateral kind of arrangements with various regions and countries. We make sure that's on the list, right? There's trade agreements and so forth. We pay a lot of attention to these questions of internet governance and openness, and make sure that we keep it open and keep that playing field level for everybody.
You just mentioned something quite interesting. I mean, in this country right now, we're negotiating a number of trade deals, one with the European Union, a few in South America, and so on. And one of the changes that happened from the days that we did the free trade agreement with the United States is that one of the drivers now is really the whole question of data, free flow of data across borders, and how that affects the entire trade picture of a country. I mean, let's talk about that trade for a minute, and then I want to go down another 20,000 feet and talk specifically about how we're all adapting. But on the trade level, we often think, well, what's trade? Trade is physical goods. Trade is oil in a pipeline, in our case, or trees, or whatever. Increasingly, it's becoming data. That then creates, though, the typical trade issues, the trade divisions that we've had with the more traditional forms of trade. So, is there a new, if you want, digital way around the digital problem of data flow across borders?
Well, it's funny. I actually think it's we haven't the sort of the trade, kind of the international trade regime has not caught up with the reality that digital trade is happening and is ubiquitous, is only growing, and is going to be a much bigger source of value going forward, and needs to be opened up. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that countries all over the world do when it comes to the internet, in terms of how they try to regulate it or protect local markets and close local markets to things that they can't get away with. They couldn't get away with if we were talking about physical goods, right? In terms of local office requirements, other kind of localization requirements, permitting, licenses, all those sorts of things. One of the things that people think China's sort of policy towards Google and other companies is about censorship. That's only part of it. A big part of it is a national champions policy to favor the local internet firms that are there in China. So I think that that the free trade principles haven't actually been applied yet, right, to data and trade in information. And I think we have to figure out a way to do that. Now, information has a lot of attributes that are very different than these commodities and these manufactured goods that we've been dealing with, right? Namely, that a lot of times it's personal information, it's right, and it's things that we have to build protections around in a way that perhaps we didn't have to think about. But we figured out a way to trade all kinds of hazardous substances, things that can do bad things to people. I think we can figure out ways to trade in information that can make us all comfortable.
And I guess that's what I mean, because in that vacuum that exists in trade policy, what's happening is, in this country we have our own champions policy when you come to look at telecoms, and the United States the same way, restricting foreign ownership of telecoms. How do you see that playing out in the next 10 or 15 years? Do you think that there's going to be inevitably the type of movement, both in the United States, Canada, Europe, and the other mature democracies that say that that is the wall that has to be breached, that you have to open up telecom to the rest of the world?
Well, look, I don't see how that's sustainable, right? You know, at some level, local firms are going to have certain advantages in the media business and so forth, I think forever. You know, in terms of some infrastructure, you know, maybe that will, you know, there are national security reasons or some other reasons that countries will agree, you know, still need to have some sort of barriers. I don't know. But I think that it's going to be the pressure, right, that this connectivity creates and the opportunities that it creates back and forth. I think it's going to be very hard to sustain the kind of regime that we currently have.
Let's take a look at Canada and the U.S. for a minute, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds about exactly what Canadian policy is.
Yeah.
But so many people view Canada and the U.S. as moving in lockstep in so many ways, that we grow the same way, we consume the same things, and so on. Are we doing the same from your point of view when it comes to entering into areas like e-commerce, cloud computing, and that sort of thing? Are the countries merging or are they diverging?
I think it's kind of both. I think there's an argument that there's some divergence here, which, you know, when I found out about it, I was talking to folks up here, you know, I was somewhat surprised by. But, you know, one stat to look at is sort of internet adoption and the, you know, sort of the internet sector by, you know, Canadian businesses and by businesses. It appears that Canada is sort of below the G20 average, right, in terms of internet adoption and sort of use of internet services. So that's G20, not G8, right? So there is a sense of reluctance to use, say, cloud computing. We heard a lot of the concerns, you know, in the previous panel and all the issues, very real issues. But I do think that that my observation, at least, is that it appears to be issues around cloud computing and the use of it, and some more concerns about it than you'll find, for instance, in the U.S. And you know, I think that a lot of those concerns are very legitimate, but there are also, you know, there's a risk, right, of falling behind, in the sense that, you know, the rest of the world is going forward with this, and it's kind of inevitable. So we got to figure out ways for everybody to plug into this in ways that you can feel comfortable from a national standpoint, in terms of what you value locally.
And I want to get into, in a minute, I want to get deeper into that whole question of security and national borders and so on. But sticking with the trends that you're seeing in terms of adapting to e-commerce, and you were just talking about where we place in the G20, what does that do to our competitiveness, which is a huge issue in this country?
Well,
you know,
again, I mean, some of this was touched on in the previous panel. I think that it's pretty obvious that some of these cloud services are cheaper, right? You can do things more productively, more efficiently, more cheaply using some of these services. And you know, the ironic thing in the debate a little bit on the security side of it and the protection of data side of it is you're likely to be more secure, right, utilizing some of these platforms that are global, that have scale, that have lots and lots of resources devoted to protecting the security. And you know, folks who do this for a living, and those platforms, you know, don't just have to be in the United States; they can be elsewhere, or companies from the United States. So I think that you know, from a competitiveness standpoint, you know, if your businesses are spending a lot more, to do the same things that businesses in other countries are doing, that's kind of not a great situation. Right, in general, especially when businesses from more countries are coming online, and the competition is only going to increase, and people realize, and you realize that there are new markets you can go after, right? So you ought to go after those markets. You ought to use the productivity gains that you can use, and you know, if you really want to compete.
It really, though, leads into the central question in a country like Canada. Why should we entrust our national data, our national secrets, to a system in another country? I mean, surely, and the argument's being made in this country by this government at both provincial and federal levels, that sensitive national information should remain within the physical boundaries, the physical borders of this country. How do you react?
Well, I can't speak to what's sort of nationals. I mean, it's one thing to say sort of national secrets. It's another thing to say any information that might be produced by a government, a provincial government, a local government, or what have you, or any information that a private sector company might have, right? And
you'd be amazed at what we think are secrets in this.
Well,
country.
fair enough, but fair enough, but so I think the reality is that right now a lot of these services are in the U.S. The United States and Canada obviously work very closely together. So I don't think that the biggest danger to the non-secret information and the secret information is sort of the United States, right? We're dealing with the cyber attacks, the cyber terrorism, that hacking, the organized efforts by governments to actually get these secrets, right, and to get corporate information and so forth. Those are the things that are the really big threats, and we're all working on those. But it would seem to me to be maybe an overreach and maybe an unfortunate one to sort of slow the adoption of some of these technologies because of a concern about the United States, for instance.
So is the equation that we're best to put our information in the hands of the Americans rather than the hands of the Chinese? Because that's our threat here. But what you're talking about,
I think that would be a pretty good idea. But yeah, if that were your choice, yes.
Let me ask you.
But there are lots of choices, and
Yeah.
in fact, that's what a lot of this is about, right?
Yeah.
Is about choice. And so before you legislate away choice for even a local government who's figuring out what to do, right? Maybe you should think about whether it's okay to have the choice. They might choose to keep it locally, right, and keep it very tight, on servers locally, or they might choose to do a lot of due diligence and a lot of work to figure out that there's some platform that exists somewhere else that actually is cheaper and is more secure and so forth. And maybe it's okay to allow that. Maybe you have some category of top secret things that can't go anywhere, and that would make sense. But in general, a lot of this is a question of what choices do you allow, and are you going to? Do you want to be very careful? And I think this is an overarching theme with regulation in the digital world generally. I think is you got to be careful about prejudging things before we know what they're going to look like, and focus on process how things are working, making sure people know the rules of the game and so forth, and not saying thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z, because I think that gets you into trouble in terms of letting innovation go.
What you'll hear from both governments and private sector in this country when it comes to cloud computing, especially if we're taking a look at storage in the United States, is the Patriot Act. You're a lawyer. You're a pretty good lawyer. How concerned should we be about the U.S. Patriot Act and how that could compromise the security of our information?
Well, yeah, the Patriot Act is something that's based on national, it's a national security law. It's actually, I think the things that people complain about are actually another law that the Patriot Act just kind of amended, but having to do with the U.S. government's ability to get information. Now, the U.S. government, like the Canadian government, can get information in all kinds of different ways, in criminal, law enforcement and in for national security matters. So the United States is not all that much different in that regard. The United States, I think, is a little more, in some ways, based on my experience with lots of countries around the world and a lot of democracies around the world, the United States is actually a little more upfront about what it does and what it can do, what its powers are. But again, I don't think that that's the major issue. The U.S. and Canada cooperate a lot on law enforcement, on national security, and so it seems there are much bigger threats out there that we ought to be worrying about, and that I think that we're doing. A lot of these global platforms are doing a good job dealing with, and I think that's really where we ought to be spending the time. Now, I'm not a big fan of a lot of these laws. At Google, we're pushing for there to be more process, not just in the U.S. but in lots of other places. More process before you can get access to data that a service provider might have. When we think the U.S. government's overreaching, we push back. We've pushed back many times, a few times fairly famously in some big court cases. So, we simultaneously will be are working on making sure governments have a good set of laws to limit what they do. But again, if you in the grand scheme of cloud computing, its benefits, where it can take you, what you can get out of it compared to the risks involved, I just wouldn't put that as the highest, the biggest risk.
I just want to point out that we do have some time left, and
Sure.
I'll be asking if anybody has a question or a comment that they'd like to put to David, please let me know. And while you're thinking about it, there was one other area I wanted to talk to you about, and that is in the critical area of developing and attracting and keeping talent, because without that, you don't grow. Other countries in the world are now beginning to understand the necessity of looking globally for the type of talent that you need to
Yeah.
grow things. Keeping in the area of the digital world and so on, what are the challenges there? How do you do it? I mean, we're down in your neck of the woods in San Francisco putting up billboards saying, you got a problem with the H-1B visa? Call 1-800-CANADA. We'll take you in.
Yeah. That's a good tactic. I mean, that's a pretty smart tactic. No, look. I think talent is global. It is one of the aspects of globalization that's pretty clear and become pretty obvious, right? And there's going to be competition, for that talent globally going forward. And I think you do well to figure out ways where people can come, where they can work productively, and be rewarded for for some of those talents. I think it's going to get tougher. I mean, right now I think there's a lot of talented people around the world who, for whatever reason, think there are 3 or 4 places that they ought to come, right, in order to to fulfill their dreams or what have you. Again, as the world's more connected, as there's more opportunity, as you can do more of these things, as better education, all of these things, I think there's going to be there's going to be a lot more than 3 or 4 places, right, that a lot of these people are thinking about going. So, but I think it's about being welcoming, creating both through social policy and economic policy, a place that's accommodating, right, and where people feel that they can put down roots and be there for a long time.
Let me just ask if anybody's got anything that they want to add to the conversation or steer it in any particular way. Sir.
Hi, David. Elliot Noss with Two Cows. You had talked about the the slow adoption of Canadian small business around cloud and general e-commerce services. The best thinking that I've seen here, connects that much more directly to the state of broadband here than to any reluctance around cloud. And I mean, the U.S. benefits by the fact that only Canadian broadband makes U.S. broadband look good. I know that Google has a number of efforts in this direction now, and just last week, a beautiful sort of global effort around broadband in developing countries where there's almost nothing going on. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of connect those two things? And
sure.
And of course, I'm required
by omitting it doesn't. I agree with you.
Yeah, and I just want to. I'm required to ask. When will Google Fiber come to Toronto or Ottawa?
Well, let me put it the way. The guy in charge of that hails from this neck of the woods, so you should maybe ask Patrick. But look, I agree with that. I think connectivity. The other part of connectivity is broadband and making sure it happens. And so nobody's ambition is to get dial-up speed to the rest of the world, right? It needs to be. We need to increase the pipes and increase the data everywhere, including the developed countries. And that's really I think we're gonna get there. We're working on a few things that that we hope can kind of show the way and how to do that. And we're very excited about the fiber project. We're scaling that up. We're iterating, going slow, but we think that we already see that there's a lot of competition in that area. So I think it all looks good. I think that people are seeing that that this is a possibility, and so people are planning to figure out how they're going to get there too. That's good. That's great. So anyway, I think the broadband, the broadband piece of this is critically important, and I think that's another aspect of government policy. There's probably no other, no single thing that you could do to usher in some of the benefits of this connected world than making sure that we have bigger pipes.
Okay. Anybody else got something you want to add? I want to go back. You were talking about. Sorry,
Okay.
if I have missed somebody, just shout. David, I want to ask you brought it up in that answer, and we touched on it before. Government policy when it comes to data flow, because I want to get back to this. This is a key question when we're talking about how you introduce, the 21st century to the 18th century, which is really what borders are all about. What is the single most important thing that governments have to do when they're looking at trade agreements with other countries when it comes to data flow and how that should roll out?
Well, a couple things. I think the thing we've been pushing a lot on over the past few years is openness, right? And making sure that that free flow, aside from the protections, right, which also matter, which you have to build in, but just making sure that governments accept this concept, right, that there should be an open, internet. And it has not been on trade agendas until recently. It has been seen as a political question, as a human rights question. It's rightly seen as, first and foremost, a human rights question. But if you're thinking about practical ways to push for internet freedom and to make sure that the internet stays open, I think getting in trade negotiations and making the economic point and saying to countries, look, if you want to be part of this, the world trade, this world trade system, you need to sign up to this. You need to make sure that you keep the internet open. I think is a good way to do it and a practical way to do it. So we've been, there's a lot more movement toward that. But that's the number one thing we've been pushing.
Expand a little bit on the human rights issue that you're talking about. I mean, how do you define that as human right?
Well, freedom of expression is human right. I mean, Article 19 of 19.
Right,
of the,
but I mean,
right,
put it into a modern context. I mean, should the internet be considered a human right?
Well, the internet access, yeah, probably. I don't see how people are going to really, live really productive lives, or at least they can live productive lives. But in terms of, fulfilling their aspirations, right, without having that. If this is the primary way people connect around the world, then it's probably pretty important, and we ought to recognize it as such.
When you survey the world, what's the single greatest impediment that you see out there right now to meeting the potential that is there but has been untapped or not unlocked yet?
Well, I think this issue of balkanization of the web, and it's going to work really well if you have platforms of various sorts that are at scale and that can talk to each other, right, and that the information can flow, right, and so the more balkanization we have, technical balkanization, because there are companies or countries that decide they don't want to talk to anybody else, or governments who decide that enough is enough of this internet business. We don't like it. All those kinds of things. I think that's the biggest impediment.
I'm still scanning the room in case anybody wants to join in. This gives me the opportunity to bring up a question I really want to ask you about. It's not exactly on the list of things, but it's got to do with something like this, the glasses. Talk to me about how that is going to revolutionize the revolution. I mean, what's the future of that?
I don't know. I think wearable computing is something that's coming, right? I think that Moore's law has made it possible to have these various devices, memory, processing power, a camera, a microphone, all these various things, speakers, in a very small package. So if you like doing certain things, on at your desktop, or if you like doing those things on a handheld device, there are people who are going to like doing that with some apparatus that they wear, right?
Yeah.
And so that makes sense. It's not going to be for everyone, clearly, but I think it's something. Whether it's glasses, there are a number of watches that people are working on. I think that's in our future. I think that they do raise lots of questions of sort of social etiquette and
right.
Organization. Possibly regulation that we'll have to contend with. But, again, let's see how it develops. Again, this thing, there's some people who think this is great. There's some people who are a little alarmed by it. Probably most people who don't care that much. But, I think that let's see how this plays out. and let's see how people use them and whether we adjust or whether we need to do something to sort of make people behave with them. But look, I think they're. I'm not sure how much I would wear them. I mean, they're pretty useful for a lot of things, but until there's an etiquette that's built up around them, I could see there's certain awkwardness that I have. I'm just being honest, but again, I think wearable computing is coming. It's going to be here, and I think it's going to improve a lot of things. I mean, you're starting to see. We now have the developers who have the glasses in their hands and they're working on them and they're coming up. That's where the real magic is going to come.
Right.
Is when people have these come up with applications for surgeons and we're going to find that there are going to be applications that are going to be really game changing, right, in certain kinds of activities and professions, and hopefully for the better. And we'll probably see some game changing ones for the worse. But I think that it's definitely here to stay.
But there's a whole generation of guys out there who remember the comic books that on the back page had X-ray glasses. You can see right through dresses. So I mean, when we heard about the Google Glasses, we went, "Wow, this is pretty cool. Yeah. The future is here."
I'm not sure that feature is in the glasses yet.
Well, it's the idea is free.
Working on it.
Yeah.
Question over here.
Sorry. Hi, Scotty. Yeah.
Two mics. Scotty Greenwood.
Hey, Scotty.
Let me take you back to China for a second, because I'm really, you were the guy that was all over international media and really leading the effort for the company. But what I'm interested in is when the company figured out it had been compromised in China, it had to be a difficult period. What was your thought process about when to disclose that publicly? And then what was it like when you decided to pull out of China? What kind of lessons do you think that holds for other companies in North America that are competing around the world?
Sure. Well, I think we, when we found out what was going on, we had to we had to sort of figure out, how deep it went, what was the, what damage was caused, and get our hands around the scope of the problem, and then we had to figure out, okay, based on that, what should we do about it? And as soon as we figured, our view was, as soon as we figured that out, we were going to go tell the world, and we did this over a matter of a few weeks, and figured it out. So, I think a big lesson, we learned was, remember, this was a reversal of a previous policy that we were heavily criticized for, which was to establish a local search engine in China behind the Chinese firewall, and and be willing to abide by these censorship laws at the margin of the search queries that we would serve up to users. And we took the position at the time, big debate, not everybody agreed, but we took the position at the time that perhaps us being there would be better. We could help change the country, open it up, and so forth. And I think we were proven that we had already been seeing the government sort of go the other way, right? Far from sort of opening up with our presence and the presence of other multinational firms there, they seem to be censoring more and to cracking down on the web more, getting more and more closed. And then this incident was sort of just the last straw for us, and decided that no, it's better for us to be on the outside of that, and people always say pulled out of China. We're still in China, and we have hundreds of people in China. Our search engine, we moved out from behind the firewall. So we operate a lot of business in China that doesn't require any of this political censorship and so forth. And we feel it's important for us to be there. But I think the lesson that we learned is that it's probably better to agitate from the outside for these truly autocratic governments, that as much as they may seem and they may talk a game about reform, you need to be very careful about that. And so, we've, as a result, there are countries we're reluctant to go into, and probably will not, because we look at their setup and we look at their laws and we say, oh, they probably got, there are a couple of cases where we look at their laws and we looked at China's laws and they were identical. So we say, okay, we know where that's going, right? So maybe we shouldn't go there either. So I think that's kind of the big lesson we learned there. It's okay for us. We're big. We want to touch all our users. it's okay for us to be on the outside, and it's okay for us to sacrifice, some profit, some earnings for that reason.
Terrific. Dave Drummond, what a pleasure
No,
sitting
it's
down
fun.
and having
This
some
is
time
fun.
with you and gazing into the
is great.
present and the future.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Tom.
much, my friend.
Great.
Thank you. Okay.